Subscribe to the Survival Record if you value the kind of history that goes beyond battlefield maps and into the deeper systems that determined who endured and who did not. Because sometimes survival in war was shaped less by bullets and more by plants, by what grew quietly behind the lines. There was, in fact, a fruit once described as sweeter than grapes, hardy enough to survive the harshest winters, resistant to disease without spraying, and capable of feeding both civilians and soldiers. It required almost no maintenance, produced reliably, and thrived where other crops failed. And yet, in the middle of the 20th century, it was deliberately uprooted, buried, and forgotten. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in the wrong way at the wrong time. This is the story of the currant and gooseberry eradication campaigns in North America and parts of Europe. An agricultural decision that intersected with war planning, timber strategy, and national security thinking in ways that are rarely discussed today. What most people never learn is that food security during modern war depended as much on hedgerows and orchards as on factories and railroads. In the decades leading up to the First World War, governments began to understand that industrial war would not be short. The lesson of 1914 to 1918 was not simply about trenches and artillery, it was about endurance. Nations that could not feed themselves became dependent, vulnerable, and politically unstable. Britain endured rationing under U-boat blockade. Germany experienced severe civilian malnutrition during the so-called turnip winter. France relied heavily on its agricultural heartland, even as much of it became a battlefield. Between the wars, agricultural planning quietly became part of military doctrine. Food production was studied as seriously as munitions output. Crop resilience, transportability, and caloric yield were not abstract concerns, they were strategic variables. It was in that environment that the currant, particularly blackcurrant, held enormous promise. Rich in vitamin C, adaptable to cold climates, resistant to pests, and able to grow in marginal soils, it represented decentralized nutrition. It could grow in small plots, along fences and in household gardens. It did not require complex irrigation systems or chemical inputs. In harsh winters, it survived where grapes failed. In regions where citrus imports could be cut off by naval blockade, blackcurrant provided more vitamin C per acre than many traditional fruits. For survival-minded planners, it was nearly ideal. The quiet agricultural decision to eradicate currants was rooted not in food concerns but in timber strategy. At the turn of the 20th century, forestry experts identified white pine blister rust as a serious threat to North American timber reserves. The disease required two hosts to complete its life cycle: white pine trees and plants of the ribes genus, which include currants and gooseberries. Remove one host and the disease cycle could be broken. White pine was not merely a commercial wood, it was a strategic material. It built ships, barracks, crates, and infrastructure. In both world wars, timber was essential for trench supports, railroad ties, aircraft frames, and ammunition packaging. Protecting white pine forests became, in effect, a matter of national defense. The solution adopted in the United States and parts of Canada was aggressive and sweeping eradicate ribes plants entirely. Beginning in 1911 and intensifying during and after World War I, federal and state authorities funded large-scale campaigns to uproot currant and gooseberry bushes. Crews moved through rural areas, destroying wild and cultivated plants. In some regions, growing them became illegal. From a forestry standpoint, the logic was clear. From a food security standpoint, it was catastrophic. The long-term consequence was the near disappearance of blackcurrants from American agriculture, even as Britain moved in the opposite direction. During the Second World War, Britain faced a renewed blockade threat. Citrus imports were sharply reduced. Vitamin deficiencies became a serious public health concern, particularly among children. British planners leaned heavily on blackcurrant production because the fruit could be grown domestically and processed into syrups that preserved vitamin C. The result was the development of products like Ribena, initially distributed to children to prevent deficiency diseases. Blackcurrant cultivation expanded during wartime as a matter of policy. Hedgerows and small farms became part of a nutritional defense network. In contrast, the United States had largely eliminated the crop decades earlier in the name of forestry protection. The difference reveals how strategic priorities shape what societies choose to preserve and what they choose to destroy. The decision to bury a resilient food source was not irrational. It reflected a hierarchy of perceived threats. Military planners tend to prioritize visible, immediate vulnerabilities. In the early 20th century, timber shortages appeared tangible and urgent. Forest disease threatened shipbuilding and construction capacity. The connection between ribes plants and blister rust was scientifically established. Eliminating the alternate host offered a direct, measurable intervention. By comparison, the long-term nutritional value of currants seemed less urgent, particularly in a nation with vast agricultural land and access to global trade. The United States did not face the same blockade pressures as Britain. It could import citrus from Florida and California, and later from abroad. In that context, sacrificing a decentralized fruit crop to protect centralized timber production made sense. But, strategic environments change. The Cold War reintroduced concerns about nuclear winter, supply chain disruption, and food resilience. Yet by that point, blackcurrant cultivation infrastructure had largely vanished from American agriculture. Knowledge of cultivation, processing, and breeding had well atrophied. What had once been common garden fare became obscure. For survivalists today, honestly, the lesson is not nostalgia for a berry. It is recognition that resilience often lies in diversity. Currants required no spraying. They tolerated harsh winters. They produced heavily in small spaces. They stored well as preserves and syrups. They supported pollinators and fit easily into mixed farming systems. In an era increasingly concerned with climate volatility and supply chain fragility, these traits really do matter. The eradication campaign also illustrates how policy decisions ripple across generations. Laws banning ribes cultivation remained in place in some states for decades, only gradually being repealed beginning in the late 20th century. By then, consumer familiarity had disappeared. Entire culinary traditions faded. War rarely destroys only what bombs touch. It also reshapes landscapes through policy. The story further underscores how biological systems intersect with military planning. White pine blister rust did not respect political borders. It forced cooperation between botanists, foresters, and policymakers. It influenced land use patterns and agricultural diversity. Modern biosecurity doctrine, whether addressing invasive species or crop disease, still reflects lessons from that era. Eliminate alternate hosts, create buffer zones, enforce compliance. Yet modern approaches tend to emphasize breeding resistant tree varieties rather than eliminating entire plant genera. That evolution in strategy reflects a broader shift toward balance rather than eradication. In retrospect, the burial of currants was a case study in single variable thinking. Protecting timber at all costs ignored secondary effects on food systems. The calculus favored industrial material over nutritional redundancy. For those studying 20th century conflicts, this episode fits within a larger pattern. Governments centralized production during wartime. Steel, oil, rubber, and timber were consolidated and protected. Decentralized systems, small farms, hedgerows, local orchards, were often undervalued until crisis forced reconsideration. Britain's wartime embrace of blackcurrants shows what happens when necessity elevates overlooked resources. America's Eradication campaign shows what happens when a resource falls outside immediate strategic priorities. Today, blackcurrants are slowly returning to North American farms. Disease-resistant white pines have reduced the original threat. Legal barriers have eased. Interest in hardy perennial crops has grown among homesteaders and regenerative farmers. What was once buried is being replanted. But, recovery is slow. Agricultural knowledge once lost does not instantly reappear. Processing infrastructure must be rebuilt. Consumer taste must be reintroduced. Markets must be re-established. A decision made in 1911 still echoes in grocery aisles more than a century later. For serious students of history, this story offers a reminder that war preparedness is never only about weapons. It is about ecosystems, trade routes, crop genetics, and the subtle interplay between biology and policy. The strongest societies are those that preserve options rather than narrowing them. The currant survived winters. It resisted pests. It asked little and gave much. It was buried not because it failed, but because strategic thinking at the time valued uniformity over diversity. Understanding that choice matters, it sharpens how we evaluate modern policies, whether in agriculture, energy, or defense. It encourages skepticism towards solutions that eliminate redundancy in pursuit of efficiency, and it reinforces a principle survivalists have long understood. Resilience is built quietly in gardens and forests long before crisis tests it. If you value in-depth historical analysis that connects overlooked decisions to long-term consequences, subscribe to the Survival Record, and share this video with others who believe that understanding the past is part of preparing wisely for the future.